Welcome back, everybody, to me talking about stuff. And today, we're not yet back to Malazan. We'll be back to Malazan on Monday, I promise. And we'll be talking about Dance's Lament because I decided to start with The Path to Ascendancy and, well, my reread of The Path to Ascendancy. And, well, Path to Ascendancies are, those are rather shorter books, so I don't expect it'll take forever for us to go through those, but Monday, Dance's Lament. So until then, we're gonna go through more of the what have you, Salman Rushdie essays, which is what we're gonna do today. There's gonna be another Discworld book talk, and there's definitely gonna be some more Black Company because I'm finally back with those as well. So this is kind of the plan for the next couple of days. And then we'll go back into Dance's Lament. And before we go into all of that, I'd just like a quick update on the Patreon. I finally got back to actually, using it in a proper way. I message people and stuff like that. So once again, I'm sorry it took me so long to do that. Life intervened and shit like that. But it's up and running now, and I finally got some of the fancy beers y'all want me to drink, or at least like started ordering them. So there's going to be some more fancy beers in the near future as well. If you want to join that Patreon, I'd obviously be extremely happy, but don't feel obliged or forced or anything. There's no exclusive videos on there at all. You just get me to, maybe knit you a fancy cap or whatever, or send you some music or, stuff like that. But it's nothing like video related will be exclusive there anyway. And speaking of that, let's actually cheer one of those patrons. That one being Joe or Joseph Byrne. I think that's how you pronounce it. I mean, I could also read it in a German way, so I'm not quite sure. I'll just go with Joe. Joe, this is for you. Thank you very, very much, and cheers. Cheers. So now that that's out of the way, let's have us a talk on the second essay in Languages of Truth. This is a short one, so probably the video will also be shorter, we'll see. And it is about an essay called Proteus. Now, Proteus doesn't start out about Proteus, the Greek god. It starts out about William Shakespeare. And then we go from there to all kinds of other things, and the wonder of life, the craziness of life, and bashing realism, which, I'm all in favor of, because I'm not exactly a very realistic person. So, yeah, this one's. I mean, I wholeheartedly agree with the points that Rushdie makes in Wonder Tales, but I also got pissed off at his treatment of fantasy literature there, and nothing like that happens in Proteus. So I'm very much like I'm happy with that. What you obviously get, and this is something that you need to understand when you read those essays. Salman Rushdie is an intellectual. He is part of a tradition that defines itself through knowing a lot, having read a lot, and showing that off. I kind of get it. I'm sort of in the same boat, although I don't quote Günter Grass or Italo Calvino here. I usually quote or like refer to Robert E. Howard, Clark Ashton Smith, or Fritz Leiber, so I'm probably a less reputable show off than Salman Rushdie. But there's a lot of like references in there that like show from like which tradition he comes, and if that kind of thing annoys you because you feel it's pretentious, then well, you have to live with that because of course it is pretentious in a lot of ways. But that's part of like the whole like role of the intellectual author that Rushdie is playing or has constructed for himself. Nevertheless, he makes good points, and this is what we're going to talk about here. So, what are we talking about? Well, there's a few asides on Shakespeare which I don't want to get into because I'm not a Shakespeare expert. I'll leave that to people who really care. But the interesting bit that we talk about here and that I feel is important, or that is like the main argument that we get to after a while, after a bit of like, showing off, is the question of metamorphoses and change and the surreal. The argument here is that that Shakespeare's big contribution to the English language and writers in the English language is his freedom, because he's not following very like classical forms, and being the influential writer that he is, people that follow his influence also have a lot more freedom than people that follow very classical structures and stuff like that. He also obviously allows a lot of like images of the fantastic into his argument. So if you've watched that video, that discussion that AP Canavan, the Critical Dragon, and Philip Chase had, you obviously seen them talk about like all the magical elements in Shakespeare. And here's the the weird thing, to come back to that Rushdie acknowledges that and actually praises him for that with his like three examples that he picks out, being the Tempest with the wizard Prospero, obviously, and being Hamlet with a ghost story and other stuff, and yeah, obviously Macbeth with the witches. But the main argument here is not so much the fantastical elements, but also that Shakespeare's stories are never just about one thing and change their like form, change their themes a lot. So then like Hamlet is a ghost story, it's also political drama, it's also psychological drama, it's also has all kinds of like funny elements in there as well. It's a lot of things at the same time, which it's cool. Now where we go from there is that this represents very much real life. Now we come to the whole to the big central point of the entire essay, that being that reality is not real in the way that realist fiction. Reality is not realistic, if that makes any sense. Reality is multi-layered. We mostly perceive it in our own personal way, which is not exactly a statistical empirical way that scientific observations work. Reality changes changes meaning and things like that all the time. So if we try to portray the truth, and this is like where we go through like it makes a difference between truth and fact, which may be an interesting discussion for a future video if you're interested in that. So when we talk about the literary truth, and that he is going for, is that life is rather surreal or not very realistic. Things happen all the time that don't make sense, that can't be foreseen, that can't be predicted, that just happen, and in our perception they're overblown, we're over dramatic, we if we are honest, the way that life feels to us as people, the way that life in that radical subjective first person perspective that we have, is full of wonder, positive and negative. Obviously there's dark things happening, but it's also a lot of like beautiful, wondrous things happening. And in the way we talk about or we perceive these things, our relationships with other people, all of that is magical, is far away from the very, very mundane drudgery that we see in what is called a realist fiction. Something, there's like two arguments here, and we're going to go through both of them in a second. One of them is the constancy argument, the other one is just like the wondrous argument. Argument one is that in realist fiction, worlds and lives are rather constant. They don't change drastically in a lot of situations unless the entire story is about a drastical change. The other one is about the magical and the wondrous. That's something, we always joke, or I always joke about like realist fiction always being about more or less middle class people in their 30s getting divorced, or other like very mundane things. And they completely leave out all the wonder and the fantastic things, that crazy shit that happens in life to each and all of us. I mean, I'm pretty sure that you all have had wondrous or fascinating or fantastic things happen to you in your lives. Sometimes terrible things, sometimes beautiful things, but always things that are like, if you would read them, they would make you like, yeah, that was invented. That kind of stories. And what I'm trying to say, the whole idea of like truth being stranger than fiction is interesting, because once we encounter it in fiction, we oftentimes go, nah, that doesn't make any sense. So the entire argument that Salman Rushdie makes here is that once we accept and realize that our lives change, that our worlds change, that we are constantly in flux and in motion, that the world out there, when we come to how we perceive it, is constantly in flux. We don't agree on anything. With there's very few things that the entire population of this planet would agree on. Guess there's a few, I don't know, but it's very, very few. Funnily enough, he makes the argument that now we agree on the fact that the earth is round, and I'm like, flat earth is unfortunately a thing. So the idea is that the world is very much undefined, or a large part of reality is undefined because we can't agree on anything. And accepting that, as a writer who tries to write about the human condition, about the reality, grapples with the reality that they face, like we all face. I think this is like an interesting aspect to keep in mind with all of these essays, is he's writing from the perspective of a writer, but a lot of that also goes for the perspective of a reader, at least for me, because I'm not a writer. The point there is that the world is in flux. It's malleable all the time, and readers should embrace that. But also writers should embrace that, and also readers should embrace that. And chiding or denigrating literature that embraces the fantastic, the surreal, the unreal, the unrealistic, to bring across a specific perspective at the world that is, in its weirdness, in its denial of constancy, of like empirical facts, in its denial of all of those things, in favor of a more, magical approach to the universe, a more like open-minded, more radically subjective approach to the world, is in fact much more realistic, because chances are we'll find someone on this planet, all those billions of people living here, for whom the world is exactly like that. And the fiction of such a thing as reality, or as the realistic, that fiction is in the end rather dry. So the argument here in the end is we should embrace that, and we should celebrate that. Something that I personally agree with wholeheartedly. And this is, I feel, something that we find in a lot of like great books of what he calls the Protean tradition. But it's also, I mean, once again, he talks about stuff like magical realism, because that's sort of the tradition that he thinks of himself being part of. But it goes for a lot of other books, and like I'll just have to drop the Malazan Book of the Fallen here, because that series of novels is also a lot of things. It's a military fantasy, it's a political argument, it's a sociological study, it's a psychological study, it's a comedy sometimes. It embraces all of those things, and by taking a fantastic world, still manages to say a lot about our world, about the reality that we all face. So yeah, if Rushdie had the time and willingness to read some good fantasy, whatever it is, I've just like pulled out the Malazan book because it's just like one of the more extreme examples of having all these elements in there, and doing exactly the things that he praises in stuff like Shakespeare. Yeah, yeah, if Rushdie had the time and effort to put in the time and effort to actually read something like that, he would probably realize that this protean tradition of literature that he praises so much is actually very much alive in all kinds of fiction, especially also in genre fiction. Although obviously there is, like, enough arguments about realism in science fiction or fantasy that you can see that the accountants of realistic fiction, of reality, of realism, are unfortunately very well and alive in the fantastical literature as well. So yeah, that's that. I had a lot of fun reading that one. I'll talk about the next one tomorrow, which will be Heraclitus, which is another interesting person, and we'll see where all of that goes tomorrow. Until then, have a great Thursday evening, and I'll talk to you tomorrow. Cheers.